In this book discussion episode of the Share Life podcast, I'm speaking with David Zahl. David, say hello.
Hey, everyone.
Today, we're going to discuss his latest book, Low Anthropology, The Unlikely Key to a Gracious View of Others and Yourself. David is the director of Mockingbird Ministries, an organization he founded in 2007. He's editor-in-chief of the Mockingbird blog and co-host of the Mockingcast podcast. David is also an author of multiple books and has written for Christianity Today and the Washington Post. He lives with his wife and 3 boys in Charlottesville, Virginia, where he also serves on the staff of Christ Episcopal Church. Today, we're talking about anthropology as it relates to our understanding of human nature. David's book is called Low Anthropology, but to get us started, we're going to chat about its opposite, high anthropology. So recently, Elon Musk tweeted his idea on how to stop the Russians' invasion of Ukraine. His suggestion came across to me as naive or high anthropology, as if the invasion was a misunderstanding that could be easily reconciled. So what is high anthropology? What is its highest form? And is Elon Musk a high anthropologist?
Well, okay. It's a really great question. Jason, the high anthropology is some view of human nature that is generally quite flattering, so that you and I are, if not perfectible, well, then we are certainly improvable. Men and women are, most of the limitations that we face are the ones we put on ourselves. And the purpose of life is to kind of transcend those limitations as best you can, and that there's not much you can't do if you put your mind to it. So any kind of view that sort of says just follow your heart, or you do you, that kind of thing, that's usually some form of high anthropology. But it's usually easier to tell what a high anthropology is by the sort of fruit of high anthropology, which is loneliness and burnout, or at least those are 2 of the fruit. If you were, we live in a culture, I would say, of definitively, squarely of high anthropology, which has a kind of implicit assumptions that we're, or that runs on these assumptions that we're capable of more than we're actually capable of doing.
Yeah.
And knowing. So if you're constantly being asked to do more than you would ever be able to do, or know more than you could ever possibly know, then you're probably breathing in the fumes of a high anthropology. Likewise,
with those limitations, would that be societal limitations too? Like you said, limitations we put on ourselves, but would that also be imposed by others or systems?
Well, a high anthropology would say that most limitations are external. Like if there are any limitations there, you are not complicit in them.
Yeah.
So that it's sort of out there. The problems with life are primarily out there. And low anthropology, which is a more sober view of human nature, would say that there is such a thing as resistance in our lives that is external, from traffic to marketing and advertising. But there's also significant internal resistance that's sort of inborn, that we have all kinds of difficulties realizing our potential that have nothing to do with the outside world, that are simply as a result of our own frailties and sort of self-orientation, things like that.
Yeah.
So it's not strictly one or the other, but I would say that high anthropology is usually blames my problems on society. And a low anthropology,
is it usually a blame more in a specific sense like that, or is it take other forms other than blaming?
Yeah, well, yes, certainly. Other than blaming, you blame yourself too when you're in a culture of high anthropology. You oftentimes, if you're living in a world that has a inflated view of what human beings are capable of, you start to think you're the only one who isn't capable of things. So loneliness is often a fruit of low anthropology. Like, I'm the only one who struggles, who feels like they're just hanging on for dear life, or just making things up as we go along. That is usually indicative of a high anthropology.
And why is loneliness a symptom of high anthropology? What's going on there?
Well, I wouldn't say it's strictly a symptom of high anthropology. Loneliness
Yeah.
is, there's something lonely about just being a person who's, has their own consciousness. But in a world of high anthropology, you're defined by your strengths and by your accomplishments. And so if that's the case, well, then you need to hide your weakness. You need to hide your vulnerabilities. You need to hide your fallibilities and your liabilities. And so if you're really editing out any kind of unsavory parts of yourself, you will never feel like anyone actually knows you, because they only know the good things about you and not the bad, or not the real.
Yeah.
And so people feel lonely usually when they feel like they cannot be known, when they have
Hmm.
to edit or curate themselves
Mm,
to be acceptable, which of course is no acceptance at all.
yeah.
You're only showing the shiny, happy parts of yourself to the world.
Yeah. And so what are some of what are some of the common forms that we see that or forms of groups or people or mindsets that we see in our society that take that high anthropological form?
Well, almost every low anthropology is usually the exception. I mean, low anthropology is also
Mm,
reality, but high anthropology, any type of mindset or strategy for improving your life that involves just sort of instruction. Like,
mm,
if I'm going to tell you to do this, and if I just give you the right information, you'll be able to do it.
yeah.
And that always runs into a brick wall of human motivation. Like, telling someone what they need to do is not the same thing as them being able to do it.
Yeah.
And so whether that applies to self-help or applies to certain political schemes, or advertising, lots of products are sold to us on the idea that if here's some information that you can buy, and then you will be able to be happier. And um, that is usually superficial. That's
Yeah.
usually superficial, given the fact that how it operates in relationships. I can tell you what you need to do. I can plead with you not to, chew with your mouth open, but sometimes that's not enough to get the person to actually. There's all sorts of other motivations going on in a person
Yeah.
rather than simply information. Excuse me.
Well, it kind of reminds me of like a lot of our parenting. Like
Mm.
that's how we parent, is like we just tell our kids as if that's going to magically change to them.
Yeah, I mean, low anthropology doesn't absolve us of the need to protect or educate people. I think
Yeah.
there's information and knowledge is super important. It's just not of primary importance, you might say. Like,
Mm,
we're predominantly emotional creatures and secondarily intellectual. So parenting is usually a way of trying to help a child and realize, and against the forces that sort of assault them, which are often internal forces as well as external forces, and to give them the best opportunity for success, which is not just giving them information. It's ridiculous to think that giving us 5-year-old better information is going to, is all you need to do as a parent. No, you need
yeah.
to sort of help them learn to deal with their own emotions. You need to help them learn to deal with the varying situations they get into in life, and you basically need to be a calm in the storm of their own personal development. So
Yeah.
there's all
And
sorts of things that go into parenting.
yeah, yeah. Now, you mentioned it's prominent. It's so prominent that low anthropology would be the exception. Would you kind of bucket that into the Western world, or do you think that's a global phenomenon? The high anthropology is a global phenomenon.
I think it's a human phenomenon, so
Okay.
yes, I would say it's global. I don't want to speak too cross culturally in terms of I think high anthropology can take different forms.
Yeah.
But certainly the march toward human self-realization, and the city shining on a hill that can that you see that in the empires of Asia just as much as you see it in the or the rise of communism or something like that. You see all sorts of ideas about how humanity is sort of moving ever forward towards a sort of a new dawn. You see that in across cultures. The question, and you just see it slightly different forms. I mean, generally speaking, people talk about Eastern cultures being more comfortable or less individualistic, generally speaking. And I think that's true, but they have as a sort of a people, they have a glorious future that they're trying to realize. And that's a high anthropology in the same way. But it's I would say it's calibrated a little bit differently. Certainly in the Western world, kind of a post-Enlightenment understand, especially sort of the French Enlightenment, where we're the worship of reason and kind of the very word enlightenment, in fact, is indicative of a sense of human beings moving toward something better in and of themselves, which is, I think, that's why the 20th century was such a gut punch to so many Europeans, because we thought we were shedding the shackles of the past, and but in fact we were harnessing technological progress to create larger, more effective forms of devastation and dehumanization. So the history is a challenge to high anthropology, while also, there are certain ways in which we've advances in science. Low anthropology, high anthropology doesn't negate the fact that we actually learn things. That is true. In fact, though, Jason, like I talk about in one of the chapters, like the whole scientific method upon which so many of our so much social progress has been predicated is based on an idea of a low anthropology, by which the human reason, there's so many blind spots and so many we're so fallen in the kind of that you cannot trust just one person. You need to get as many people together to run as many of the same experiments as many times as possible and trying to disprove each other. And that progress, to the extent that it happens, is a slow, laborious process. That the Francis Bacon was coming from a very low anthropology, actually, which formed the bedrock of this discovery, which is incredible. So
well, yeah, and that's interesting that you say that, just in terms of like what I see as the decay of that scientific I don't know if superiority is the right word, but just sort of high regard for science, like the trust in our institutions and science as a society seems to be dwindling for a variety of reasons, some of which are probably justified. But we are simply replacing that authority with ourselves as the authority, right? So it's not like we're fixing the problem, we're just moving it around, it seems.
That could be. I don't disagree with you.
So what speaking of technology, and Elon Musk, how would you sort of frame him and a lot of his innovations and just technology in general, AI, it certainly seems like we're creating some great things, but those great things may not turn out to be so great when we start using them.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of Musk, I don't want to comment on him specifically because I think he's a fascinating guy. He's a jumble of all sorts of forces, and I think the world is a more interesting place with Elon Musk in it, to be perfectly honest with you. I think Silicon Valley itself, from which he's kind of the paragon of in certain ways, like I think that it is a very high anthropology. It's an attempt to sort of transcend our limitations through technology and kind of but it's also profits directly on people's low anthropology. So
the irony, right?
Yeah, well, without our need to feel better about ourselves and our desire to justify ourselves and the kind of predictability of the human psyche when it comes to what angers us and what motivates us. Like, none of these platforms would work in the same way they do, and yet at the same time, it's like a sort of a gnostic, like there's this sort of high order of people that are kind of above. You read about Silicon Valley people that don't allow their kids to use their own inventions, and I think that that's very telling. In the book, I talk about the invention of the like button, just as an example of something that was engineered with a very high anthropology. The like button on Facebook, Justin Rosenstein's gone on record as the guy, one of the engineers behind it, saying that they really thought at Facebook they were doing something to sort of increase solidarity, and a way to encourage people, and to pass on love even. And the notion that it would be used for something different than what they intended, aka to make social media into a popularity contest, the likes of which the world has never seen. Like, that didn't occur to anyone. And so the anthropology in that room was off the charts high. And naive.
And that's fairly scary, because I mean, it's like to miss out on sort of the biggest blind spot, so to speak, and then for that blind spot to be completely sucker punched.
It's the stakes are not low here. Like there's, you have adolescent people, girls and boys alike, hating themselves, cutting themselves because of responses they get on social media, which are largely the result of a model that was premised on a completely false understanding of human nature that stumbled into various mechanisms that Madison Avenue knew about, that have by which we can be manipulated. It's a very sad state of affairs. At the same time, like there's some great things about social media, so I'm not like 100% against it, but I think largely speaking, it's a great object lesson in if one of the people in that room, like if Facebook had been created by someone in their 50s, I think it'd feel very different. That said, maybe Facebook could have never been created by someone in their 50s, but it just goes to show you how much is at play here.
So that gives us a picture of high anthropology. So let's shift gears to low anthropology. On a previous episode of this podcast, a friend of mine was discussing the church. He was a Christian, and he said that he's yet to see a church board invite others to participate because it's really going to be painful. And so, in reflection of his comment, I was thinking about it and wondering, like, who actually is preaching, that come join me, it's going to be painful. And the person that came to mind was Jordan Peterson. And he says things like, if you can't see yourself as a Nazi concentration camp guard, then you don't know yourself. Now, my difference with Peterson is that he doesn't go low enough in recognizing that we are destined to fail in our response without God's direct intervention. But I'd like you to explore these ideas: the lack of low anthropology in the church, the power of low anthropology, and the limits of low anthropology without God. So let's start with the first, and let's talk about low anthropology in the church, or the lack of it.
There is, I think the church has been entrusted. I think the church as bedrock can have a deep appreciation of low anthropology, simply because it exists to talk about the gospel and talk about God, and God, who is God, but who we're all people who need God, rather than not. God is not just sort of like our friend in the sky or something like that. It's we and in the Bible we talk about original sin, and we talk about we're created beings, not God. And there's a God and you're not him, is how So I think that the church has a conflicted relationship with this. What we have in the church is sort of a selectively high anthropology, where once you become a Christian, like what leads you, sort of your own personal need, limitations, conflictedness, doubleness, and self-centeredness leads you to be open to the idea of a savior God. And then once you become a Christian or become religious, then you're sort of told, well, okay, well, now you're sort of in the door. Now it's sort of time to go back to kind of you now have a higher, now you're more capable. It's sort of some ideas about the Holy Spirit saying like, now it's time for
Yeah.
you to start climbing that ladder. And it becomes a burnout situation for a lot of people, or they feel baited and switched because they thought, hey, I thought this thing was all about mercy and forgiveness, and here I am like feeling like I'm being judged for not being a good enough Christian,
Mm,
or I'm feeling exhausted by the whole project.
yeah.
This thing that I thought was a refuge has become another project. And so we have in the church oftentimes a selectively high anthropology, which is the same exact or a very similar fallout to just the high anthropology in general. I often think it's unintentional. So yeah, but there are also, this is the reason the the way that sort of liturgical traditions have developed are usually in a way to sort of counteract that and counterbalance those tendencies to sort of turn Christianity into like a self-help scheme. Like the church that I go to, which is an Episcopal church, and liturgically, like every single week, no matter who you are, no matter how long you've been a Christian, you come in and you say the confession, and you say that you're a sinner, and that you are looking to God to feed you and to transform you and to love you and to forgive you. And that doesn't change. That's what continues. So I think there are powerful examples throughout the ages of Christianity being the religion of low anthropology, which it is not a religion that says there's no such thing as change or improvement. It just puts the onus on God for those things. So
Yeah. So any thoughts on my friend's comment about yet to see a church board invite others to participate because it's going to be really painful?
well, yeah, I think that's true. We want to market ourselves as happy and cooperative, and that most of the path towards spiritual transformation is painful, and you don't invite people, you don't lead with that, because no one wants pain, but unfortunately it comes to all of us. And so I think that how the church is able to, I think the church at its best can again be the place to bring your pain that you're already feeling. Like it's not like and to bring your lack and to bring your need, and to put yourself in the position to receive God's mercy and forgiveness and the fellowship of other Christians and things like that. But on one level, that's why the church is always going to be somewhat countercultural, Jason, because
Yeah.
we don't shy away. What T.S. Eliot once said: the church exists to remind human beings of that which they would rather forget, which is the fact of sin and death. Like,
Yeah.
so on one level, we're never going to be ascendant in that regard, and to the extent we are, we're probably ignoring part of our birthright.
Yeah.
And yet sin and death cannot be escaped. So they can be put off, but never escaped.
Yeah.
That helps deal with your question.
Yeah. Yeah. So if someone, if they really kind of take the idea of low anthropology serious, what would you say is the power behind that type of view of human, just the nature of human life?
The power of low anthropology is the power of love, because again, there's no love where there's no admittance of the full person, and there's no full person without both your best and your worst. And so love. I was talking to someone that I was at a wedding and listening to the toasts given by the bridesmaids and the groomsmen, and all of them were sort of like, they weren't like, hey, this person getting married is the most beautiful or successful or impressive guy. Like, it was always like, yes, she's great, yes, she's lovely, she's my dear friend, but let me tell you what she's like in her sweatpants on a Tuesday night.
Yeah.
It's like, let me tell you what she's really like, and that's the person I know, and I love her, not
Yeah.
just the made up bride. Same with the guys. It's like, yes, he's reliable, he's my man, he's been loyal, he's been fun, but he also, was there on a Wednesday night when he'd had too much to drink, and we had to, the police had come, and we got up into some real nonsense, and I've watched him fall on his face, and that's why I love him. So
Yeah.
that's the power of low anthropology. I mean, ultimately, the power of low anthropology is the power of God, because it's just the gateway to a view of ourselves in which we need low anthropology in the sense of being a person with limitations, and with a will that is compromised, and that's sort of even a dark side to our human nature. It means that you are a person who needs help,
Yeah.
and you need help from other people. So it's an invitation to friendship and collaboration, but ultimately you need help from God. And so
Hmm.
a low anthropology without God can be somewhat defeating, and I think nihilistic. It happens to be true nonetheless, but it is still, I see those things as um, the doorway to something much bigger than yourself. But you don't really go through that doorway until you've exhausted your own resources. On the other hand, Jason, though, I think that the difference between high and low anthropology is the difference between walking through the world resentful that people aren't better than they are, or they're not more like you, or reality doesn't conform to your sense of what it should be, that it falls short of it, or walking through the world with a sense of awe and wonder that, given what people are like, and given what other people have been like to me and what I've been like to them, look at how much beauty and goodness is on display, and how much the hand of God moves in the world, and how much joy there is. So this is this counterintuitive truth about it all.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. No, that's good. What would you say to someone that's like, well, hey, I don't really I don't really believe in low or high anthropology. I just think most people struggle with, lacking empathy, or not understanding the goodness. Like, how would you respond to someone like that?
Well, I mean, it's, again, low anthropology isn't saying that there's nothing good in you. It's saying that there's both in you, and that uh people want to break I think there's anthropologies are charted on this continuum, and
Hmm.
none of us, part of a low anthropology is that none of us hold our quote unquote anthropology with any consistency. There are times when I say, oh, I think people stink, but then when someone actually cuts me off in traffic or acts in a malicious way towards me, I'm totally shocked and scandalized. So that would say, or I know plenty of people who say, well, human beings are basically good, getting better, and look at our society, and very sort of have a very progressive view of the world, and yet they're deeply cynical about their own ability to change, or other people. So it's not like
Hmm.
there's a consistency going on here. I would just say that what's truer, what's more reliably true, if I want to find a way to connect with other people rather than hate them, I need to look for the chinks in the armor, and the stuff that they're hiding. That's going to be
Hmm.
where I actually find love. If I look only at their greatest achievements, I'm going to find envy and jealousy and resentment of myself or them. And so, I'm willing for people to say, I had someone on the other day say, I'm not into a high anthropology or low anthropology. I'm into a reasonable anthropology. Well, that to me is just a euphemism for low anthropology. People get very scared of any kind of negativity. But we are living under such a tyranny of positivity that a little bit more negativity, allowance for it, will have the counterintuitive effect, I guarantee, of lightening the burden
Hmm.
rather than increasing it.
So is there much difference between low and high anthropology and low and high expectations?
Um, yeah, I think low anthropology does lower expectations.
Yeah.
Though again, it's not consistent.
Mm.
Um, a person who understands their own low anthropology knows that they are conflicted. They are doubled, is how I talked about it, doubleness. So we have all sorts of ways in which we know we should have lower expectations of other people, but we don't.
Mm,
And that's a problem.
yeah.
And so does it equate always to high versus low expectations? I don't know. I know
Yeah.
that a low anthropology in theory would have more realistic expectations of human beings, but higher expectations of God.
Mm,
And so that's or a Christian low anthropology does say just because I can't change, just because I can't engineer a goodness or righteousness, doesn't mean it cannot be engineered. It doesn't mean that victory is out of the question. It actually I think increases hope for that reason.
yeah. So I want to talk a little bit more specifically about low anthropology, where it meets God and the resurrection. And so, my biggest fear that I had, that I kind of faced head on several years ago, was one of corruption,
Mm.
physically, mentally, and spiritually. I feared not only that I'd fall away from God, but that I'd become an active adversary of him. You state in your book that a high anthropology maintains that we combat the aging process at all costs. In my case, it was an effort to combat corruption at all costs while failing miserably along the way. What was so transformative for me was to recognize that I had been an enemy of God, and yet he still pursued and saved me. And if I fall away again, he'll do the same. In your book, you state that a high anthropology transforms the church from a hospital for sinners into a schoolhouse, or even boot camp for saints. It seems even as Christians, we failed to accept the severity of the problem and our active part in it. Instead of surrendering to this truth, we shore up our army and go on the attack. What's going on here?
um yeah, I'm trying to think of like exactly what I was trying to say there. But what you've basically articulated is an understanding of grace as God's fundamental disposition towards you has been, you thought it was all up to you to root out corruption consistently and effectively, only to realize that God was after you all along, and
Yeah.
the any good news of Christianity would not be predicated on your ability to sort of do the right thing with any regularity. So here you have this glorious good news in the midst of your failure and exhaustion that
In
God
fact,
has.
to some degree, it's as if God needed me to be exhausted to do his work.
Well,
Right.
I mean, that's what we call that's what I would refer to as the distinction between the law and the gospel, that God sort of brings us to the end of ourselves so that he might be makes us smaller so that he might be made larger. Like I think what my brother says it well. He says that God's office is at the end of your rope. And sometimes it's only through, the preaching of the law, be perfect, therefore, as your Father in heaven is perfect, that you kind of come to be like, well, hold on, I'm trying to not worry and to not be lustful and not be angry, all these Sermon on the Mount injunctions, but I'm finding it impossible. What hope do I have? And at that point, you finally, when you've exhausted your own resources, you look to outside yourself, eh,
Yeah.
beyond yourself, and you say, and you hear the words that what is impossible with man is possible with God. And those are the same mouth of the person of Jesus Christ, who was just telling you, you need to do all these things, so it's, I tend to think that when I come into contact with the commands of Jesus, they're usually, if I hear them correctly, they're not really, they're bringing me to the end of myself so that I might create faith, I might have some faith in God.
Yeah.
So to bring you to that point of exhaustion, Jason, I don't think it's a bad thing. I think that's generally how people change in life, is through some form of desperation or love,
Yeah.
or you might say love in the midst of desperation.
Yeah. And then that's, like you said earlier, and that you mentioned in the book a lot, that allows us to connect with others.
Definitely.
I like the idea of the phrase, like, permission to go second. If I share just my own struggles with somebody else, perhaps it's like a friend of mine. I've done this with several people, just talking about my struggles with pornography in the past, and how that played out. And then they hear me and they're like, oh, I'm facing that same thing. So now it feels safe for them to talk to me about it, because I had someone that talked to me about it, right?
Yeah. I mean, isn't that the way any kind of help ever works? It's like you feel safe. All of a sudden, instead of being told by someone, just stop doing that, you're told by someone, hey, I have that same problem, and
Yeah,
let me tell you how terrible it is. Like let's talk about this. And all of a
yeah,
sudden your walls fall down, and you don't feel like you're the only one who's incapable of just, yes, I know that pornography never makes me feel that good in the end. I know that it's not helpful to or healthy in almost any respect.
yeah,
And yet that hasn't stopped me from, like, the experience of that is experience of almost like addiction and compulsion.
yeah,
And so how does those cycle ever break? It doesn't break through injunction or pressure. It usually breaks through some act of intervening love, which is what you've just
yeah.
described.
And then also, I think also what you kind of focus too on is this idea of when it's not one thing, it's another, right? And so, I might have progress in that area, but now all of a sudden I'm struggling in another area with contempt or, whatever it might be. And it's not like um, I'm immune to my sin just because I've had progress in an area. And I think that's something that you emphasize in, right?
Yeah. I mean, I really think the experience of growth in the Christian life is an experience into dependence rather than to independence. Like, that sounds like pithy. I didn't even mean to make it sound so pithy, but it's uh, increased awareness of your own smallness,
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
God's largeness, the bigness of God. Remember in Monty Python, "Oh Lord, you are so big, so very, very big." And I think that's what it feels like, rather than increased victory in, because we will never get to be the sort of people that need God any less. Like, that's not,
Yeah.
if the point of the Christian life, if what Jesus is cares about most, and what it is faith, like, it seems like
Yeah.
faith is what God is after, then why would God make us into people that no longer need faith? It's
Yeah.
just, but somehow we imbibe that in the Christian, like, I'm going to grow to the point
Mm,
where I need God less. And that may not be what we think, but that's actually where, if you play it
mm,
out a few steps further, like, that's where it goes. But in fact, we grow into the stage where we realize we need God more.
yeah.
And that's more of deeper comfort and rest and less anxiety, I think, than the opposite.
Yeah. I mean, that reminds me just of the story of Job. We get to the end of the story and Job is super small and God is super big, and God doesn't give any answers.
Mm,
He just shows how big he is and reveals to Job how small he is. And that was
yeah.
all that he needed.
That's all that, yeah. And it's, I mean, want I don't want to imply that, like, low anthropology will save your life. I think God is the force for good,
Yeah.
and redemption. So low anthropology is simply a helpful, I've found to be a helpful, uh, linguistic, cipher, almost, for getting into, the permission to be weak, to be needy, to be, guilty, um, so that you might look to God for that which you cannot provide yourself.
Yeah.
Or, and also, but it also yields things like friendship, curiosity, openness. Um, a low anthropology actually doesn't say people are never capable of great things. It says, I don't know exactly I can't write the script for another person 100%. So, it's a cynical view is a more high anthropology view, which says I can be absolutely certain 100% of what you are going to do, say, and feel. And a
Mm,
low anthropology says, actually, there's a God and you're not it. So you don't actually know. You may have an informed guess, an informed hypothesis, but you actually don't know. And
yeah.
that again leaves the door open.
Well, and in
A
that sense, it seems like
hopeful.
cynicism um, is again a selective form of high anthropology, where it's perhaps a high anthropology of self and a low anthropology of everyone else.
Yes. Exactly. Or good, you can also have a high anthropology of other people and a low one of yourself, and that's equally destructive. That's sort of self-loathing versus
Yeah,
self-righteousness, and those
yeah,
are two sides of the same high anthropology coin, I think.
yeah. So, kind of pulling back to the other statement that I pulled out from your book, high anthropology transforms the church from a hospital for sinners into a schoolhouse or even boot camp for saints. I kind of wanted to pull that out because I think the way that we visualize our work, um, I think when we think of our work as Christians, like we're soldiers in this boot camp for God, it seems like it can lead us down some sort of kind of, I think about like the culture war and things like that, where that starts to inform like we're supposed to fight for God in our culture. And I like the hospital metaphor better because I think it's more helpful and maybe more directly related to the type of work we're supposed to do. But I don't know, how do you reconcile that type of imagery when we think about the work we're doing and how that plays a role?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most transformative communities are the ones that are based on an admission of common weakness and sin and need. That's like the AA model of growth, and those tend not to be very militaristic groups that are going
Yeah.
to conquer the world and impose their values on other people, but instead um, be more like what is it? Two blind people looking for food, or two beggars telling another beggar where to find food. I think that that's the much more compelling model of Christian faith, and for that reason, I don't see. I mean, if you have a high anthropology view where Christians are sort of categorically different than non-Christians, and you sort of think that they're sort of infused with a new righteousness that is makes them better or different, well, then you're going to really divide the world into categories. If I believe that people actually remain sinners, that the Holy Spirit is active and alive, and that God's work, God uses people, but is not like never changes them to the point of like being somehow categorically different, then I'm going to have much more sympathy for my fellow sufferers. And I
Hmm.
find that to be of immense importance when it comes to how I view change in the world and loving other people. And do I approach people from a point of view that I need to defeat them somehow, or do I see everyone as in bondage or in suffering to themselves and other forces beyond their control and in need of love and God? So that's a low anthropology view. Actually, I think motivates more love and service for one's neighbor, because you're no longer sort of resenting your neighbor for not being better than they are,
Yeah.
but accepting that they're just like you, and they might, their low anthropology may be manifesting itself in a different way, or
Mm,
it maybe hopefully it just gives you a little, at least if not love, and then some patience.
yeah.
Um, High anthropology tends to create resentments and categories and divisions, and then just divisions lead to downright opposition, and
Yeah.
you have to say those people are either evil or insane, and that's
Mm,
the only way to make sense of them. But to actually know another person, once you realize, oh, they've lost their father too, or oh, they've got this compulsive problem they can't seem to fix, and they're lashing out. I mean, that's a doesn't change that, doesn't mean that everything they're doing is somehow excused, but it certainly allows you to put a little bit of a distance between the action or the position and the person themselves, which is certainly what I think Christ did.
yeah. How would you like sort that out in terms of dealing with like broken people versus someone that is like is actually abusing people in a position of power, um perhaps in a secretive way, like how would you sort of distinguish the difference between under having that empathy and understanding, but also not allowing not allowing that uh that sin to let people continue to be abused as well?
Yeah, well, I think a low anthropology is not surprised by sin, and I think a high anthropology is. And
Mm,
so Low anthropology is quicker to, I think, actually say, well, hey,
Mm,
hold on a second. Is something really terrible happening here? In which case, this we could say this needs to stop right now, and there's no excuse for this. Now
yeah.
that doesn't mean the person themselves is beyond redemption, and the world wants to say that they are, that there's no
Mm,
distinction between them and their actions. And a low anthropology would say that they're in tied in all sorts of knots, and the way that they're low anthropology, it's actually wreaking havoc on those around them and genuine damage. Um, so there's like a difference here, I think, like in a right now there's a popularity of certain books or just cultural buzzwords like vulnerability, and we just need to be open about our weakness and our vulnerabilities and our chinks in our armor, and I think that's really good, but it doesn't allow for the fact that sometimes the things with which I struggle end up hurting the people around me,
yeah.
um, and um, and that there is a moral component to our low anthropology that needs to be forgiven or needs to be, but before it can be forgiven, often the times just needs to be stopped.
Yeah.
It doesn't say that just because someone's misbehaving that therefore it's okay.
Yeah.
It says there may be reasons behind it, and we might be able to empathize in certain ways, but doesn't excuse it.
Yeah.
So it just explains it.
Mm,
So yeah, I would hope in my experience, communities of low anthropology are not communities that are trying to rationalize away people's abuse of one another. They're actually
yeah.
trying to say, they're actually able to call a thing what it is, because their entire
Mm,
metaphysical world is not under threat.
mm,
Um, so maybe people have had different experiences of that. Like at church where there's abuse going on, it's often there's a sense in which this pastor, somehow this Christian, can't be doing that because they're better than they are, or
mhm.
they've got the Holy Spirit, or there's that's that kind of stuff is what that kind of high anthropology leads to, or there's an idolatry of the leader that again has imputed to them a higher capability. That's the sort of thing that keeps people's eyes closed.
Yeah. Okay. Is there anything else about the book you'd want to share as we close up here?
Well, I'll just say I think it's a deeply the people that have read it that I trust seem to think that it's very, very, as if there's a negative bent to how it sounds, like the net effect of the book is one of relief, comfort, and hope. Um, and that any kind of lasting hope, that it has to be built on an accurate view of ourselves, and in a deeper faith in God, in fact. So I hope people like it, and I hope people feel seen uh, by the book, but also with compassion, and pointed toward the one that actually, God Himself, who has more compassion than this author does.
Yeah, yeah. Before we close out here, would you tell us a little bit about Mockingbird, your ministry, the podcast, the blog, the event?
Sure. Mockingbird is an organization, as you said in the intro, we were founded 15 years ago. And the purpose of Mockingbird is to basically connect the Christian faith with everyday life, but in all sorts of different ways. And we do that. What we've developed is what today is called a platform. So we have podcasts, and we have events, and we have a print magazine, and we have a very active blog. But when I say connect, what we're really doing is we're trying to underline uh, and identify the way that God's grace plays out in the world and in our own lives. And sometimes that's through highlighting its absence. Sometimes I really feel like the central truth of the Christian faith has to do with the mercy and forgiveness of God, and the hope of the resurrection. And that is not, the base note for which Christianity is always known, but Mockingbird is certainly trying to rehabilitate in that direction, albeit with an eye to low anthropology and to, transparency along those lines. Just really, I see Christianity as deeply of good news. So, what that looks like in our podcast, we'll talk about various articles, about whether it be about mental health, or whether it be about relationships, or whether that be about theology or psychology or sometimes larger like social trends and things like that, but always with the emphasis on grace as it relates to where you and I are living in 2022.
Cool. Well, how can people connect with you, the book, get the book, visit the web,
Sure.
visit Mockingbird, subscribe?
mbird.com is where most of that happens. At Mockingcast, you can find it wherever. That's our principal podcast. The book is called Low Anthropology, and it's available on Amazon or wherever you get books. The audio book of it will be available November 15th. The print
Cool.
version has been available for 2 months now. And we've got lots of events that are going on. I'm about to go to one in Texas, and we'll do one in Winter Park or Orlando, Florida in January, and then New York in spring.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for sharing your life with us today, David.
Thank you, Jason. Thanks for having me on.